Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies. And this is Anderson James from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. Anderson James. The Reverend James Anderson, D.D., is well known to all Masons as the compiler of the celebrated Book of Constitutions. The date and place of his birth have not yet been discovered with certainty, but the date was probably 1680, and the place Aberdeen in Scotland, where he was educated and where he probably took the degrees of M.A. and D.D. At some unascertained period, he migrated to London, and our first precise knowledge of him, derived from a document in the state records, is that on February 15, 1709 through 1710, he, as a Presbyterian minister, took over the lease of a chapel in Shallow Street, Piccadilly, from a congregation of French Protestants which desired to dispose of it because of their decreasing prosperity. During the following decade, he published several sermons and is said to have lost a considerable sum of money dabbling in the South Sea scheme. Where and when his connection with Freemasonry commenced has not yet been discovered, but he must have been a fairly prominent member of the craft, because on September 29, 1721, he was ordered by the Grand Lodge, which had been established in London in 1717, to digest the old Gothic constitutions in a new and better method. On the 27th of December following, his work was finished, and the Grand Lodge appointed a committee of 14 learned brethren to examine and report upon it. The report was made on the 15th of March, 1722, and after a few amendments, Anderson's work was formally approved and ordered to be printed for the benefit of the lodges, which was done in 1723. This is now the well-known Book of Constitutions, which contains the history of Masonry, or more correctly, architecture, the ancient charges, and the general regulations, as the same were in use in many old lodges. In 1738, a second edition was published. Both editions have become exceedingly rare, and copies of them bring fancy prices among the collectors of old Masonic books. Its intrinsic value is derived only from the fact that it contains the first printed copy of the old charges, and also the general regulations. The history of Masonry which precedes these, and constitutes the body of the work, is fanciful, unreliable, and pretentious to a degree that often leads to absurdity. The craft is greatly indebted to Anderson for his labors in reorganizing the institution, but doubtless it would have been better if he had contented himself with giving the records of the Grand Lodge from 1717 to 1738, which are contained in his second edition, and with preserving for us the charges and regulations which, without his industry, might have been lost. No Masonic writer would now venture to quote Anderson as authority for the history of the order anterior to the 18th century. It must also be added that in the republication of the old charges, in the edition of 1738, he made several important alterations and interpolations, which greatly gave some offense to the Grand Lodge, and which rendered the second edition of no authority in this respect. In the year 1723, when his first edition of the Constitutions appeared, he was Master of Lodge 17, and he was appointed Grand Warden, and also became chaplain to the Earl of Buchan. In 1732, he published a voluminous work entitled Royal Genealogies, or the Genealogical Tables of Emperors, Kings and Princes from Adam to these times. In 1733, he issued a theological pamphlet on Unity and Trinity, and Trinity and Unity. In 1734, he removed with a part of his congregation from his chapel in Swallow Street to one in Lyle Street, Leicester Fields, in consequence to some difference with his people, the nature of which is unknown. In 1735, he represented to Grand Lodge that a new edition of the Book of Constitutions was become necessary, and he was ordered to lay his materials before the present and former Grand Officers. In 1738, the new Book of Constitutions was approved of by Grand Lodge and ordered to be printed. Anderson died on May 28, 1739, and was buried in Bun Hill Fields with a Masonic funeral, which is thus reported in the Daily Post of June 2nd. Last night was interred the corpse of Dr. Anderson, a dissenting teacher, in a very remarkable deep grave. His pall was supported by 5 dissenting teachers and the Reverend Dr. Desaguliers. It was followed by about a dozen of Freemasons who encircled the grave, and after Dr. Early had harangued on the uncertainty of life, without one word of the deceased, the brethren, in a most solemn dismal posture, lifted up their hands, sighed, and struck their aprons 3 times in honor to the deceased. Soon after his death, another of his works, entitled News from Elysium, or Dialogues of the Dead, was issued, and in 1742 there appeared the first volume of a genealogical history of the House of Every, also from his pen. E.L.H. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.